So, Professor Warwick, what did you think of the convocation? Tom studied his audience a bit and gave Miver's hand a squeeze. He hadn't planned on being in the minister's suite that evening, but convocation was essentially a matter of seminars and discussions on policy. It would normally have bored him to tears, but Minister Earlyon had taken things in an unexpected direction. Her announcement set a new goal for the ministry to reach out to the other races of the Imperium in a search to incorporate their cultural perspectives and talents into the Imperial mandate. As a matter of policy, it seemed natural enough, but over the past week, Tom had come to get a very different picture of Duchess Earlyon. He wasn't entirely certain why she was willing to reach out with her address to the non-sure races of the Empire, but she seemed in earnest, and her seemingly mild statement had gone off like a gunshot in a cloister. I believe what you said was important, but I don't think it was very well received. I heard some people muttering about Imperial values. Tom fought off an urge to squirm in the couch seat, and Garnier shot him an inquiring look. The minister only chuckled. I'm sure they did. I see to the administration of education for the whole of the Empire, but sometimes I think the biggest children are in my ministry. Earlyon nodded indulgently. Unfortunately for some, no single moral framework can be applied to everything. Believe it or not, it's not always easy to determine what's right for an entire society. I thought that by pressing for the best education possible for students everywhere, I was doing what was best. You've given me a great deal to reconsider about going one step further, and it's time they do the same. You don't think it's too much, too fast? Tom asked. It felt like an odd question. It was everything he should want, but he'd seen the reactions too. He glanced over at Miver, knowing they'd discuss it later. It was a comfort he cherished, and he made a note to call Shalea later in the week. It was past time for another date, and this would certainly be something to talk about. I think a lot of people back home on Earth don't appreciate the sentiments of your audience, or the size of it. Perhaps, Professor Warwick, everyone understands the need for change in the abstract, but people from every station in life, every species, are all creatures of habit. Too much innovation turning their lives upside down will lead them to revolt. That's why there are no greater challenges than the uplift of a new species. Earlyon shrugged. In the end, I shall get less than I want, yet more than they want to give, but the goal will be moved for the future. And that's enough? It has to be. If I tried to move things too far or too quickly, I would face a revolt within my own ministry and lose the confidence of the Empress. But I think you've made the case that we must look at moving faster, or we are going to risk losing the trust of the peoples that make up the Imperium. Success depends in no small amount on how you frame these matters. For stability to hold true, you need to show respect to established traditions and ways of doing things. We found that far more often, stability comes through gradual improvements. Radical disruptions tend to be fiercely resisted. Earlyon regarded him and sipped her drink. Can you tell me humans are that different? Tom thought about it. Every radical change from Plato to Darwin to Salk had faced radical resistance, most of all from the people in their own professions, who were vested in accepted knowledge and practices. Every year since the invasion, he'd watched the resistance die, not only from the force of the Imperial military, but by degrees, as young people who couldn't even remember the invasion were becoming adults. Instead of fighting another damn war in the Gulf over oil, they were breathing clean air and looking to horizons the size of the galaxy. There were still problems. Pay inequality, grabbing Marines, but the clean air was nice, and living without a Russian nuke pointed at you. What have the Romans ever done for us? He muttered, but shook his head at their looks of incomprehension. It doesn't matter. If I said humans were different, I'd be lying. I do want to thank you, though. For what, Professor? Living up to the promise. Tom sought for the right words. My own country had a habit of thinking it was the best thing going, and you could sometimes believe that, right up until you heard about someone being hurt over the colour of their skin or saw someone homeless on the street. Power doesn't always live up to its potential. It's nice to see. Even if it's only by degrees? Leon asked mildly. Tom couldn't help the feeling he was being evaluated by an even wilier version of Garnier. But for today, he didn't think that was possible. If it's progress that sticks, yes. Pavis, Clips, Cosren wasn't having a good night. Some hunts tried the soul, and on particularly taxing nights it was difficult to not look back on her early career as a journalist without a distant stab of anguish. As a serious telejournalist working for Network 23, she'd been doing well for herself, carving out a career as a dependable field reporter, willing to do what it took to get the story. Her competitive nature, fierce determination to get an edge over the other channels, and the stamina of youth were all the advantages she needed. That was until the simcasters came along. It had turned out to be a passing fad, but for a few uncertain years, networks turned to simulated reporters, animated figures controlled and recorded by voice actors. The move allowed studios to cut costs over live journalists, and as the fad went on, work became progressively more scarce. Clip still had a deep loathing of Praltha. Network 23 had turned one into an animated waterfowl that swam in circles across a simulated pond while reading the news. For the weather, they changed the pond to match. It was widely considered to be adorable, child-friendly, and most of all cost-effective. As her peers began to filter into other careers or jobs within the industry to make ends meet, Clips had focused more than ever on survival. Telejournalism was her element, and she refused to give it up without a fight. Driven to desperate measures, she had taken to spending spare time watching the celebrity circuit, as well as developing a penchant for artificially inflating the news. It added luster to her reputation that allowed her career to survive while others had sunk into the deeps. Of course, that sort of thing was unsustainable in the long term, and Clips had been driven to increasingly desperate measures. Inspiration struck during a period when some elements of the public developed a nascent interest in animal attacks, and sensing a trend, that was when she had the idea. The Andrilacra Forest Park and Nature Preserve lay a good 3 hours beyond the farthest suburbs of the capital, which still made it close to home as a scenic vacation spot. Nestled along the end of the Andrilacra mountain range where it met the coast, the park was a favourite getaway for families in summer. During the fall, not so much. As a familiar location, though, it was perfect, and after checking the week before to ensure there were no guests, Clips had procured a quantity of Grinshaw mating spray, which she liberally spread around Camp Area 6. The spray was benign in and of itself. Forestry agents and farmers used it to either draw the creatures away from inhabited areas, if one became a danger, or as a trap law if one decided to take to an area and refused to leave. Clips had finished setting the spray before taking refuge in the ocean overlook, on the cliffs about half a mile away. The camera angle was perfect to look out over the bay, but also captured a commanding vantage over the campsites, where she'd hoped for prime shots of the rutting beasts wandering through and tearing up the much-beloved camping site. Unfortunately, she hadn't checked on the grounds the day before, and so missed a late booking by the friends of Drafel Rotarian Club. While she had watched aghast as the campers poured in, any trace of conscience urging her to warn them away from the site had been distant at best, and during the ensuing 3 hours, Clips had footage of the Rotarians valiantly staving off free-heated and overly amorous animals, including one particular woman who made a valiant response, armed only with a cooking skewer and a water poncho. No one was harmed at the end of the catastrophe, and after scratching up several of the family vans and destroying the pavilion tent, the 3 monstrous females wandered off with the group's food chest and an inflatable latex rikiri that had implausibly popped out of one of the many rent and torn pieces of luggage. As a news piece, it was solid gold, and for a while, Clips had basked in the warm feeling of job security. It lasted for almost a week before one of the Rotarians, apparently connected enough to get movement from the local forestry agents, had demanded an investigation. Traces of the mating spray were discovered, and while nothing had ever pointed back to Clips, the resulting stigma attached itself firmly with suspicious executives and her immediate boss, who harbored deep suspicions at an invertebrate street crawler such as herself ever being struck with an uncharacteristic desire to go explore nature armed with a full field cam pack. Finding herself abruptly unemployed by the network and her reputation besmirched with other reputable agencies, her stubborn nature and determination found another outlet. Once scorned, Clips took to the life of a freelancer, reporting with a joyous abandon that she never would have previously suspected of harboring. Freed from the constraints of lower management, Clips had dived into the realm of ambushing random celebrities and compromised nobility all over the capital, preferably both at once. And while her former employers never actually dedicated resources to celebrity gossip, there wasn't a network around that wouldn't buy footage of an especially juicy escapade. Pavis embraced her nickname and never looked back. Admittedly, there were times like this evening where the hunt wasn't going so well. While all the planet was covering the Empress's departure with a shared sorrow for the loss of the heir, and mourning for her loss as a mother, Clips knew that life would go on. Within a few days of her Imperial Majesty's departure, the public would be hungry for some distraction, and anyone armed with the right bit of salacious footage would be able to command a nice price for it. While combing the usual channels, there had been a story that briefly grabbed public interest. An actual human was working as a professor. While that was significant, the matter only properly came to light when the human, a male no less, became a featured interview for a segment of Meet the Imperium. While there was a mild furor from some quarters over a human male teaching impressionable young nobles, the matter soon passed out of the public eye. Clips, however, smelled money on the table. After other newscasters had given up the chase, she knew that a story about a human male and all those girls would be just the thing. Whether the students were taking advantage or the male was behaving improperly, it didn't really matter. It was a story that would sell itself, however it spun. The damnable thing was not being allowed on the Academy grounds. With a truculent wariness of lawyers left over from the Grinshaw incident, Clip steered well clear, opting to stake out the entrance of the campus. Nestled along the coast, Empress Zarika's Academy for Young Ladies had one entry to the grounds, and after bribing her contacts around the capital, and scouring social media from anyone at or connected to the Academy, a tenuous connection to a new restaurant had come to light, as well as some gossip that a human male had been seen around the city, not only cooking at the new hotspot, but dancing at a street festival and clubbing with a family of media moguls. It couldn't get any better, and the news left Clips practically salivating. That only made the human all the more frustrating when she eventually spotted him. After a heated chase, where she being cut off by traffic in Prelitori, she made it to the restaurant too late to get any footage, much less ask questions. Holed up in the kitchen, the owner had steadfastly resisted her waving the dilapidated press badge, and sneered at her cover story that she was doing a story on the ethnic dining scene. Admittedly, the matter hadn't been helped by Clips's level of hygiene and overall appearance. Staking out the side of a highway for days didn't require much, and she dressed for comfort. The years since being ousted by Network 23 hadn't done much for her daily care either, and her slovenly appearance had progressively burgeoned with new layers of flab. The diet of a freelance reporter generally wasn't very healthy, varying between fast junk food and starvation, if the trail was hot. Her appearance might have given the story a certain lack of credibility. Still, the evasion on the way to the restaurant and the stinging refusal by the head waiter to get inside the kitchens has cemented it in her mind. The human was up to something, and she had no intention of missing out. Thus far today, she'd eaten 6 fried Contrap Supremes, washed down with an Ubeki fizz that had long since gone flat and warm. It left her feeling queasy and not in the best state of mind. All the same, she remained undeterred, and was on the scene by evening when a hot tip reached her that there was not one, but 2 humans at the annual educational convocation. Racing into the capital, she managed to mix in with the few other reporters covering the event with desultory grace. They didn't have any clue about the story right onto their tusks, and she had no intention of tipping them off. A human male and a female, right there under the same roof. Goddess only knew what sort of escapades were going on behind the scenes, and if she could just get the right footage, she'd be primed and ready when the calls went out for feel-good stories and fodder for the gossip columns next week. Arriving in the late afternoon, her time spent with the other press, one from Capital News and another anchor from Network 14, hadn't gone well. They were snobs, both of them, and while she'd remembered to tuck an air freshener tag from the van under her shirt, she was dimly aware that her body odour and lack of appropriate dress discomforted the other reporters, as she'd taken up station at the back of the auditorium. Sure enough, after a few minutes, she spotted a human male, dressed in a school uniform along with others in a small group, while off on the far side of the room there was yet another human, a woman, dressed in her own academy colours. Jackpot. Well, almost. First, there would need to be something of interest, and while the speech by the Minister of Education went on for almost an hour, a picture of a human just sitting and listening to a talk wasn't going to sell worth a credit. It was the social that evening that held real promise, and when the room filed out to go change for the evening social, Clips had dutifully stationed herself behind a potted vetria bush in the hotel lobby, with a view of the elevators. She'd been waiting, primed and ready to spring out for almost 2 hours, when the hotel security found her. The trio of women were well dressed, but they moved like a pod of ex-Marines, as they escorted her out of the lobby. Clips looked back just in time to see the male human stepping out of the elevator in a sequined suit, while she was escorted outside. The anchorwoman from Network 14 looked back, to give her a cheeky smile before following the party into the dining room. Those fucking bitches! They're stealing my story! With every step out of the hotel, the more agitated she became. As she made it back to her van, Clips Kosrin was certain of one thing. She was going to get the money shot on that human, no matter what it took. Hi. Tom had spotted the only other human at the convocation early into the morning, on the first day, but given the commitments to stick with Garnia's group, spent time with the minister, and enjoying the first evening with Mavere after the fact, he'd not been able to either find her, or make the time until nearly the end of the second day. Now, standing awkwardly at her table, Tom saw the placard for Sorgo Academy, and knew he was in the right place. You must be Hope Classen. Professor Livingston, I presume. She smiled and stood up, and they had an awkward laugh as he extended a fist and she offered him a handshake. She nodded to the chair just beside her. Whatever could have given me away? I was wondering the same thing. Could be that we stand out in the crowd. Maybe a little. Hope canted her head and looked him over. Loved the sequin number you wore last night. Yeah. The local haute culture for men leaves a lot to be desired. He could feel the blush creeping over him, which wasn't helped by sitting with a pretty woman, a human woman in her late 20s, as she smothered a laugh. You look just right. When in Rome and all that. It takes a while, but for a man, you look very, dashing. That suit looks like Liberace's wardrobe had a love child with Elton John's. He gave a self-depreciating grimace, and Hope laughed again. I know it was normal for a night in the town here, but it's still going to take a lot of getting used to. That's right. You're newly off the ship from Earth. Welcome to life in the big city. You'll get used to it, she said, arching an eyebrow. So how can I help you, Professor Warwick? Please, call me Tom. He shook his head. Standing on the difference between their ages seems silly, considering the setting. You're the first human I've seen in almost 6 months. All right, Tom it is. As long as you call me Hope, she nodded amiably, as their conversation collapsed into a private bubble amidst the hubbub of the conference hall. You've been making quite a name for yourself in a short time, and my brother has been getting an earful about you from your student. Belder, he supplied, as he thought it over. I wouldn't expect I make very good conversation between two 18-year-olds out on a date. She asked me a lot of questions for things to talk about with Liam. She was pretty keen on making a good impression. I could tell. I'm going to guess this isn't just a social call to introduce yourself, is it? She sighed, looking away briefly. She is a nice girl. If she were human, you could plant her in a 4-H club back home, and she'd fit right in. A farm girl and her Turoks? Yeah, I get that image, sometimes. Her family is nobility, but Willis is still a farm world. An important one, but she's definitely kept to her roots. He nodded, thinking of his conversations with her over the last few months. She's also one of the brightest students I have, and if there's a mean bone in her body, I haven't seen any sign of it yet. Since your academy is only open to nobles, that's saying something, she offered quietly. It is, though I do have one problem student. They aren't all buckets of sunshine, he admitted ruefully, as he considered what he really wanted to say and coming up short. I understand about indecision, and I didn't want to press you on anything, but I did want to ask. About Belder and Liam. It's alright. I've been thinking about it this whole shell, and I have to talk to him when I get back. You're going to find that it's not easy being the only human you see for months at a time. You fall out of practice, she said. Her face scrunched up briefly, wrinkling her nose. I had a lot of coaching from the best people when I arrived here, but I never expected to be the family matron, Shilvanti style, with my own brother. Try to imagine being thrust into the role of a Shilvanti parent all of a sudden. I'm trying. Tom felt a pang of regret about Deshin, but nodded as he shoved the thought aside. I expect that was a lurch. You have no idea. In a lot of ways, it felt like I left Liam behind as a toddler on Earth. Having him here as a grown-up is a lot different than keeping in touch through emails, Hope said, as she ran a hand back through her hair, and paused as the group shouldered past their table. I expect Belder has all the usual expectations. I just don't know what kind of future they could have together. Does she expect him to go back to Willis with her? Is she willing to go back to Earth if that's what he wants? I know, he nodded sympathetically, calling up all the conversations he'd had with Mevere about her situation. It seems a little premature to start planning people's whole futures out after only 3 dates, but that's the noble houses. With men being scarce as hen's teeth, they don't screw around when it comes to that sort of thing. I guess if Belder wasn't a noble, they could just date and see what happened with all the time they needed. But she isn't. She's just doing what her family expects of her. I know. That's what makes me feel so awful. Hope deflated slightly. I know she's doing it all the right way. I've spent so many years acting like I was made out of stone just to make a place for myself. I couldn't help my reaction when she came out of the blue like that. Liam hadn't even been here for 3 months. And now? He asked carefully. I'm going to set some expectations for her. Hope looked at him earnestly, while canting her head as if daring him to question her on it. He didn't, and she continued. I want her to hold off at least 6 dates, before she even starts thinking about talking to her parents or making long-term plans. That will give me more time to talk to Liam and beat some of the Shilvanti facts of life into his thick skull. Belder can do that to honor me as the human matriarch of my house, and it will let me see if she's flexible enough to do it. Waiting for 6 whole dates? Tom grinned ruefully, making a note from the marriage fundamentals class. That's being quite revolutionary, don't you think? Tom, you're going to find out sooner or later. The Imperium and the Shilvanti system isn't kind to squeaky wheels. Hope looked at him carefully, and he couldn't escape the feeling she was speaking with the voice of experience. Ganya, I really do want to thank you for hosting me at the Academy this past week. Rebecca smiled, as the pair shared a bottle of blue Grail in the leisure area of her suite. I must admit, it wasn't at all what I was expecting, but that's no bad thing. And a successful convocation as well. I firmly believe that your plan to extend higher opportunities to other races of the Imperium will be quite an incentive to succeed. We can't simply extend the gift of knowledge unless we're willing to follow through. Garnia inspected her drink. While not her usual choice, it had been a long shell. Productive, but long. We've been holding the other races out of senior administration for far too long. The Ministry of Education will be making an open statement to the rest of the bureaucracy. Why the long face, then? Rebecca canted ahead and looked at her curiously. If the convocation was such a success, then why so downcast? Please, do not mistake my melancholy. I am terribly sorry to have given any other impression, Garnia smiled. I am simply not looking forward to returning to the office tomorrow. Really? That's rather unlike you. Rev set her glass down and leaned forward, wearing an expression of consternation. You have a fine protégé in Mivere. She's come a long way in the last few years since you began grooming her, and you seem to have things in hand at the academy, although I'd be rather surprised if you didn't. Oh, I'm just musing upon a matter that exceeds my grasp. Garnia sipped at her drink and glanced over at Rebecca, who merely arched an eyebrow as an open invitation. The academy is doing rather splendidly. However, I will admit there is one particular problem I'm wrestling with, and I still haven't come up with anything like an adequate solution. Garnia, you and your Professor Warwick have given me a fresh outlook on our outreach to the younger species. If there's a spinefish in the pool of life, perhaps this is my turn to be of assistance to you. Moral turpitude! She thundered. As a criminal charge, Mavisti Riche couldn't say she'd heard of it, but there seemed to be no doubt that her Imperial Majesty's Minister of Education, Duchess Rebecca Earlyon, was in considerable earnest about the matter. She quailed in her seat, trying to process what the woman was saying. But Don't. Just don't even start, the minister hissed. The kinds of things you've been up to? I'll be surprised if you escape without facing serious prison time. But Her mind reeled. When she received a summons to visit with the minister, she presumed it was about renegotiating the new contract on textbooks and training manuals. I said I don't want to hear it. When I got the reports, I just wanted to see you for myself. Reports? Don't play coy with me. Why, this latest one alone, date rape. Trying to get a human professor, a male, drunk, just so you could have your way with him, no doubt, is disgusting. Minister Earlyon shook her head. And you, a married woman. But why are you... Oh, you want to know why I, Minister of Education for Her Imperial Majesty, after working over a decade to improve the education of non-Chauvante species, would take an interest in your loathsome affairs? It's not like you're out on Earth, no, right here in the capital. And you thought I wouldn't take an interest? I didn't think... Her mind reeled as she tried to wrap her mind around the scope of the disaster. I'm sure if... Do not try and hand me your lame excuses. I had to consider which would give me more satisfaction, covering all this up or exposing you. Earlyon settled back in her office chair and gave her a look of utter disgust. It took me some time to decide, but with the Empress away from Shill, I think it's a very good time to clean house. It was just one time, honestly. Mavis recoiled. Prison time? Over a human? It was unbelievable, but a pet project by an Imperial minister was another matter entirely. Warwick was a nobody, but as long as he was under the watchful eye of a Duchess... Please, reconsider. Can't I change your mind? I'll do anything. Why should I bother? What do you think you could possibly do? Earlyon stifled a bored sigh. When I think of briefing Her Majesty after her return, once she is out of mourning, of course, well, if I were you, I'd give careful consideration. Anything! Mavisti cried out in horror. It must have been passed to her from the interior. They watched everything. Having her name on the Empress's lips right after coming out of mourning, she'll be ruined. I gave him a good interview, positive press. I'll never go near him again. That's barely a start. Do you realize how far you may have set back my program? I'll fund all the training materials on Earth. The minister raised an eyebrow. There was interest. It was a thread of hope, and she grasped for it like a lifeline. For a year! Minister Earlyon steepled her fingertips and looked at her coolly. 2 years. 2 years? Unless you'd rather quibble than be a free woman. Earlyon waved at her airily, as if the matter was still on the fence. I'd have to exert my influence to cover this. 2 years! Mavis nodded. She'd have to talk to the family, of course. Utter silence. Anything to bury this, instead of letting it reach the Empress's ear. Whoever did that right after the woman came out of mourning wasn't likely to survive the experience. I just wanted to be certain. 2 years is very reasonable, Minister. I suppose it might help my project along. Earlyon canted her head and closed her eyes, deep in thought. Of course, that just leaves one loose end. Loose end? She stuttered. The phrase looming like a dangerous reef. Just as safe harbour came into view. I'm sure whatever it is, something can be done? I suppose. She opened her eyes and focused upon her distastefully. For one thing, you're going to leave Warwick alone. You obviously can't handle temptation. And I want your resignation from any academic boards and activities on my desk by tomorrow. I don't want to think about you anywhere near impressionable children. Of course, all of them. Mavisti nodded frantically. By tomorrow. Very well. But don't think to cross me on this. The minister arched an eyebrow in pique. I suppose the nobility has to stick together. At least the minister was a sensible noble, and willing to show compassion to someone several ranks beneath her. After a few parting words, Mavisti couldn't escape from the office fast enough. Resigning? After all these years on the alumni committee? Are you absolutely certain about this, Mavisti? Ganya kept the smile from her face as she leaned back in her office chair. There wasn't a video connection, but she didn't want to risk anything creeping into her voice, and she forged ahead dolefully. It's going to be such a terrible blow to the school. I am, Rocher said firmly. I have to take more of the business over. My sister, it's a family matter. You know how it is? Oh dear. I am so sorry. Of course I accept your resignation. You have to help take care of your family first. Ganya heaved a sigh, but opted for a tone of solemn honesty. It helped her strangle the giggle she felt clawing its way to the surface. It just won't be the same without you, but you're doing the right thing. In the outer office, Pelly smiled. While muffled through the thick wood door, she could still hear as the head administrator cheered. Apparently, it was the start of a good week. I swear by the goddess, Ganya, that was the most fun I've had in months, Rebecca said over the call. How was she when she resigned? Mavisti Rocher isn't going to change her ways that easily. She gave me a story about needing to take care of her sister. She didn't. Oh, yes. One thing she doesn't suffer from is a deficit of pride. Ganya shook her head firmly. If I could have handled the woman any other way, I would have done so a long time ago. The abominable way she treats her children, and her shenanigans on the alumni committee was bad enough, but going after one of our professors and risking our reputation was the last straw. Putting herself and her petty interests over the school or her family. I suppose trying to save face only makes sense, but honestly, media people can just be awful. Rebecca huffed and shook her head over the vidlink. At least she was prompt. Otherwise, I'd worry I'd lost my touch. Anyway, I still had fun, and you say the daughter is worth it? Nestha? Yes, I do think so. Ganya nodded with a certain satisfaction. I plan to keep an eye on her through Mavere over the next 2 years, but she has wit, intelligence, and good manners. Her heart is in the right place, and I expect that much can be done with her if given the chance. Well then, that makes it worthwhile. I have to spend all of my time fighting the big battles. It's nice to savor a small win every once in a while. Rebecca nodded. Take care of Mavere and Professor Warwick, Ganya, and tell Jama I won't be a stranger. How do you commit a perfect murder? As the early rays of morning sunlight filtered in through the window, she considered the matter while sipping her tea. The day had a while before it began. Might as well put that time to use. Tapping her Omnipad, the vid screen in the living room started playing the news. Certainly you need to break down the matter. The victim unquestionably needed to be dead, but it was a novice mistake to confuse dead with untraceable. A dead body could provide any number of clues to skilled forensic scientists, but that didn't mean getting rid of the body was essential. The story had been playing since late last night. The Empress had left Shill. The talking head on the newscast was reminding her co-host that it was a time-honored tradition for any member of the royal family to be retrieved, whatever the cost, and laid to rest in their home soil. It was a tradition demanded by the goddess, and anything less would be seen as impious by the military and the clergy. Not that anyone believed Empress Kamalesh would do anything less for Princess Kalandri. Kamalesh loved her daughter and loved her military, and the people had loved Kalandri. With diligent preparation and attention to detail, you could eliminate telltale evidence from being left at the scene. The co-anchor looked good this morning, in a red cross-cut blazer. He nodded, a picture of sincere understanding, before pointing out it had just been over 200 years since the last state funeral of this kind. The military and the clergy would probably try and make it into a spectacle, regardless of what the Empress wanted. Neither of them named names. It wouldn't do to upset the people who'd use a state funeral to advance their personal agendas. Follow that preparation with a reasonable amount of forethought, as you could plant clues that might misdirect the most thorough investigation. Rather than face the problem of removing a body, you could make it an asset. She switched the newscast off. The only piece of useful information was the departure. Core elements of the home fleet, led by the flagship, would bear the Empress, Princess Camordri, Prince Laurel, and his first wife, Duchess Trinia, as well as members of the royal court on the sacred journey to reclaim some trace of Kalandri for the ceremony. A round trip to the LD 326 star cluster would take roughly 7 weeks. Give or take a week on site, and the Empress would be away from Shill for almost 2 months. All the proper steps were being taken for the security of the Empire, and the court would certainly be back on Shill before the news filtered throughout the galaxy. It was still a window of opportunity. The only necessary component in committing a perfect murder was that, no matter what. Pausing, she examined her reflection on the darkened screen. It's acceptable, as long as it doesn't come back to you. Lamana Duvari set down her tea and gathered up her notes before class. There are several necessary traits that an assassin must have or develop to be effective. The agent always believed that introspection was undervalued, and should certainly be at the top of the list. After all, the individual should know their skills, yet be ready and able to innovate once in the field to achieve a successful conclusion. The assassin must have the required knowledge and ability to bring the assignment to a successful conclusion. There were easily 20 ways to kill someone in a locked room. After all, it was impossible to do in a literal sense, which simply left the matter of creating the illusion. The manner of the death was almost secondary, compared to the art of misdirection involved. Nor should the effort to create the mystery itself be considered a wasted effort. A successful murder depended on leveraging the knowledge and ability, and turning those skills into advantages. Timing, concealment, silence. Key elements which lent themselves to a lack of discovery, evasion, and escape, to say nothing of successfully evading detection by the authorities. The elements of a locked room mystery was only another ingredient of misdirection, but it required a certain artistry. The agent had every confidence of success, though, in fairness, her employer had removed the electronic impediments. Security codes were overridden. A pass card opened locked doors with ease. Video surveillance promised to be looped within a certain window of access and egress. With every electronic measure seen to, tonight became a pedestrian affair. A laughably primitive exercise involving little more than avoiding some insomniac walking the halls. Assassination wasn't murder, after all. Murder was typically a crime of passion committed by someone who knew the victim, or at least had a connection and motivation. Assassination was a skill. While her time in the Marines had been short, it had been fundamental to her current life. Imperial medicine could cure PTSD after all, but sociopathy was ingrained. That was also an advantage. An assassin should be without remorse or sympathy, simply devoid of feelings for anyone or anything. They must be at ease with risk-taking and be able to lie, cheat and steal with impunity. Sociopathy was an asset, and she'd been recruited by the Legion of the Interior soon after diagnosis. Most of her life since had been spent living comfortably, with infrequent calls to work by her unknown handler. It was a life of boredom punctuated by enjoyable novelty, patches of colour in an otherwise comfortable yet unremarkable existence. There were times when she wondered how many peers she had. It wasn't an abstract question. Her seventh assignment had been to kill another killer, someone like herself who had been showing too much innovation, too much independence. The implication from her employer was clear, though, in fairness, that assignment had been one of her favourites. Tonight had been anticlimactic. She was just a little thing, after all, though death had a way of diminishing the victim. There was no one there anymore. In another few hours, they would be missed. Authorities would be called. Time of death would be established, and the authorities would begin to plod forward. That wasn't to be dismissive of modern forensic science. No, the study had become an obsessive passion, another aspect of her art. She knew what was looked at and looked for, and she knew how to give them nothing. To a mere murderer, the greatest aggravation had been crossing the damn grounds. To her, the grounds were her friend. Rather than take a vehicle in or leave one parked within miles of her target where it could be seen, she had a long hike ahead of her. The distance wasn't that far, but it took longer to cross terrain without leaving a trace. With luck, she would reach her camping gear in 6 hours. Another week would get her to her egress. Thankfully, Her Imperial Majesty did love the nature preserves that surrounded the capital. It wasn't even dull. She'd be the last woman to say she wasn't her own best company, and infiltration and exfiltration were the framework within which her art was hung. By the next shell, she would be relaxing at home. The objective was dead.